Hello, everyone. Peter Maravellis here on behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers and the City Lights Foundation. I'd like to welcome you to another installment of City Lights Live, the virtual extension of the City Lights events calendar, where we continue to celebrate the works of authors we know and love through readings, discussions, and forums. I would like to take this moment at the outset to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We would like to take this moment to offer respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. Tonight, we begin the fall season's calendar celebrating a new book by Chloe Aridjis. It is published by Catapult Books. It's called Dialogue with a Somnambulist, Stories, Essays, and a Portrait Gallery. The Faulkner Award-winning Chloe Aridjis now offers readers her first collection of shorter work. It's comprised of stories and essays. Dialogue with the Somnambulist transports the reader into liminal, often dreamlike spaces, exploring the complexities of exile and urban alienation. In her latest offering, she shows us how she is just at home writing in the short form as in her longer fiction. We are really great fans of her work here at City Lights, and it's always a pleasure to be able to celebrate a publication of one of her new works. Chloe Aridjis is a Mexican-American writer based in London. She is the author of 3 novels, the award-winning Book of Clouds, also Asunder, and Sea Monsters, which was awarded the 2020 Faulkner Award. Ms. Aridjis has written for several art journals and was guest curator at the Leonora Carrington exhibit at the Tate, Liverpool. She is a founding member of the XR Writers Rebel, a group of writers who focus on addressing biodiversity loss and climate emergency. Joining her tonight is Lydia Millet. Lydia Millet has written more than a dozen novels and short story collections, including her most recent titled Dinosaurs, and a children's Bible, which was a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction, and one of the New York Times Book Review's Best 10 Books of 2020. She's won numerous awards for her fiction, has been a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize. She's been worked as a writer and editor at the Center for Biological Diversity. Really an honor to have her with us as well. So before we begin, I'd like to let you know we'll be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of Dialogue with the Somnambulist, as well as other books. So join us now in offering a warm welcome to Chloe Aridjis and Lydia Millet. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you. So I wanted to say, I think maybe you're going to read for us in just a moment. I just wanted to say, to me, I loved the dreaminess of this book, which sort of was present not only in the fiction, but also in a way in the essays, which is sort of a rare thing to find in that form. So love the dreaminess. And yeah, maybe you could read a brief piece for us all, so people who haven't read the book can get a sense of it. Sure.
I thought maybe I'd read the opening to an essay called Hymn to the Stray Dog, just because, well, like Lydia, other species will be part of we care a lot about other species and want them to be will be part of this conversation. And this essay originated, well, I had the idea for the essay when I handed in my manuscript for my last novel and Sea Monsters, and my editors commented on how many mentions of stray dogs there were in the book, and 37.
37.
And I said, 37. And I said, well, the thing is, if you're Mexican, stray dogs form part of every landscape, cityscape, rural, and are always in the background. And so I began thinking more and more about stray dogs and my love for them, and also sort of the metaphorical weight they have. So anyway, I'll just read the opening probably to this. Hymn to the Stray Dog. Here it comes, its gait bold and determined, or else hesitant and subdued, depending on its experience in the world thus far. Here it is, making its way towards us, dodging cars, hugging walls, sniffing out the situation, on the lookout for voices or gestures that may grant some insight into a temperament. The stray dog. It must gauge what the human intends before coming any closer, whether he or she intends kindness or cruelty. It isn't aware of the social contract between us, but I am, and I shall honor it as best I can, despite concerns about startling it away or frightening it into defensive mode. It takes a few steps forward, devours my offering, and vanishes back into the labyrinth of Mexico City. In London, one rarely sees stray dogs. Not long ago, a Mexican friend who lives here too commented on how she misses seeing stray dogs in the background. The city feels somewhat empty without them, she said, like there's something missing from the panorama. I remember being struck by her words and dwelling on them for a long while afterwards. If anything, I was thankful for their absence, not because I don't love dogs, I certainly do, but because ever since childhood, the sight of a stray had nearly always triggered despair. Where did it come from? Where was it going? Always hungry, always on the move. On family car trips, I couldn't avert my eyes quickly enough from the road. The sight of one run over would haunt me for days. Yet I now began to think about how, despite their precarious situation, so unresolved, they represent an indomitable spirit, and in this aspect too, they are emblematic of our country. Over the centuries, dogs have been an enduring feature of Mexican life and art. Long before the Spanish conquistadors arrived in the New World with their snarling wolfhounds and mastiffs, the breed most familiar to the Aztecs was the hairless black Xoloscuincle, or Cholo for short. In life, it was a companion and foodstuff, indeed a delicacy for the nobles, and often used to warm a cold bed at night. In death, the Cholo was considered to be a guide through the underworld and would carry the soul of its deceased owner in its mouth. Yet the Spaniards who sailed over in the late 1510s and early 1520s used their hounds as weapons of war and transformed the dog from ally into adversary, a feared animal that would often tear its victims to pieces. Once the conquest was largely complete and the dog's job for the most part done, they were said to hungrily roam the streets in search of prey, thus becoming, perhaps, the earliest incarnation of strays in Mexico. Since those times, the dog has returned to being a creature man can easily subjugate, but somewhere within its scrawny figure resides the phantom of that battle. So that's the opening of the Stray Dogs.
Great, thank you. So, well, first off, this book is made up of pieces that span like several years in terms of, when they were written. What made you decide to put them together, and also to sort of cross genres in a single volume, which is, not so commonly done?
Mm. Well, it's strange. It became a complete hybrid of a book, and then I was approached by two editors of a very, very small press in London called Housebower Press, Gareth Evans and Jessica Chandler, and they publish one book a year. They're based in Hackney, and they actually started this press several years ago because Gareth especially had a very close relationship to John Berger, and they wanted to publish work of his and realized, well, we actually have to start our own press to do exactly what, create the book we want. So each year they publish one, and I think the second year was Anne Michaels, and this was the fourth book. But anyway, and then they said, well, why don't we gather together all your work over the past 15, 20 years. And I realized suddenly you take stock of everything you've been writing between and around the novels and working through themes and subjects that somehow didn't make them into the longer books. And then a lot of the shorter fiction were stories I wrote in Berlin before I'd even written or published my first novel. So you write with a freedom and also a sense of complete liberation, not knowing whether anyone's going to read a word you write. And so a lot of these short stories, like the title one of the Somnambulist, I wrote very early on during my years in Berlin. And then somehow, once I had them all gathered, the order somehow just seemed very obvious to me, the order and the juxtapositions between the stories, which aren't in chronological order at all. And the earliest one was the Kafka Society from 2005. And I guess the most recent was the essay I wrote on magic lanterns last autumn. But I wanted, and I have an essay there about Aby Warburg, and I thought a lot about just sort of startling collisions and strange juxtapositions and how placing certain works after others would somehow give each one meaning or some strange sort of quiet cross-pollination going on. And then at the end, I have a portrait gallery, which are short essays I wrote about different cultural figures, some of whom I knew, like Mavis Gallant or Leonora Carrington, and then others like Dino Lipatti, my favorite pianist. And there, I was very drawn to the idea of sort of written portraiture and conjuring someone up through a few vignettes, and so that I sort of thought of the book as a little museum, and with fiction, essay, and then the portraits.
I thought the detail in the Petra Kelly piece about the the little wooden, I think it was a wooden carved fish, was very poignant.
Mm.
Which
Yeah.
was sent shortly before her death, I suppose, too. Do you feel like you have I have a very, very vexed relationship with older books of mine, almost as though we've broken up and are estranged, you know. And I'm wondering if you kind of feel differently about the older pieces in this collection, and if you sort of have any kind of confusion around the versions of yourself that are sort of combined in the book, or are you perfectly at peace with all previous selves?
I strangely am, which is I some of the it's strange because I realize I did indulge every sort of impulse towards the more fantastical or humorous, and sometimes I rein that in a little more in my novels, I think. And like the piece on the circus flea, or the lightning strike survivors, or yeah, sometimes every now and then I think, well, I guess I just indulged those impulses and took them as far as I wanted to go. And but then I realized that somehow they all fed into the novels in some way, and they were sort of sketches of a sort, or atmospheres that I was already trying to, or inhabiting, and characters, marginal characters, and mostly in cities, and so that it was already setting a certain tone and mood for the longer pieces. But and because several of them have never been published, I went back and polished a few of the stories before they came out. So
oh, that's nice. That's a great luxury.
I could live
with. To be able to edit something old is a boon, I think. Well, you know, your work strikes me as very, and I'm sure people have said this many times, but it strikes me as very continental, sort of very European continental. Often, like, reminds me of, you know, Bruno Schultz or Walser or Calvino, more than anything else, I think. And I guess I'm wondering, obviously, so you grew up, maybe you could tell us a bit, first of all, of a little bit of your biography, and sort of explain how you came to live in London, even though you have this varied background and still have a close relationship with Mexico and with your parents. And yeah, so maybe just tell us, because it's a pretty interesting life story, I think.
My father's Mexican, my mother's from New York, and I grew up I was born in New York, and then when I was 8 months old, we moved to Holland, and I spent most of my childhood in Holland. So yeah, my father's a poet, then he was also cultural attaché and ambassador, and then we moved back to Mexico in 1980, and so I spent my adolescence in Mexico City, and those years were very formative, as well as 2 summers in Berlin in 86 and 88, when really cast a spell, and that's why I returned there in my 20s, my late 20s and 30s. But and then so then Mexico City for my adolescence, and then I went to college in the US, and then did my graduate studies, my master's and PhD at Oxford in 19th century French poetry. And I worked with a magnificent tutor named Malcolm Bowie, who wrote a lot about Proust and Lacan. He wrote a lot about psychoanalysis and also Michaud, 20th century Belgian French literature. But anyway, so he believed very strongly. I was very marked by those years with Malcolm Bowie also, because he believed very strongly and supported me in a more interdisciplinary approach to literature. So for my PhD, I wrote on 2 magicians, 2 19th century magicians and their memoirs, and aligned with the poets of the period. And he really taught me to read poetry in a different way, and just always look for the most unusual angle to enter a work or your own text. And so, and then when I finished, I wanted very much to write my first book. So I moved to Berlin and promised myself I wouldn't leave Berlin until I'd finished my first novel and found a publisher. So those took longer than I thought. And so I moved back to England after 5.5 years in Berlin, and I've been there ever since in England. So, but the main constellation is still very much Mexico City, Berlin, and London. And my sister lives in New York, and my parents in Mexico City. So Well, but sorry to answer your question, Lydia. So when I grew up reading mostly European literature, and I think that would be my main, if one speaks about influences and atmospheres, I feel very strongly that's what I gravitate towards always. So.
Yeah, I was reminded of like in the story about the wax figure, I was reminded of the tailor's dummies and Street of Crocodiles and stuff. You know, there was a lot of sort of echoes of some of that earlier 20th century writing, and it's sort of philosophical bent. It's maybe contemplative, meditative, not exactly self-involved version of interiority. It's sort of less self-involved than some American fiction, I think, somehow, or less involved in the interpersonal social somehow, and more in the existential, I guess, if that makes any sense at all. So it sounds like, when I see you described, you're always described as Mexican American, but and I know that's legally true or whatever, and partly historically true, but correct me if I'm wrong, I don't feel you identify really as a US person, and you don't sort of smack of US-ness in your writing. Do you think that's, and if that's the case, it would be great if you could talk a little bit about writing in English as opposed to writing in Spanish, which you also could have done. And perhaps do sometimes, I don't know, but maybe, yeah, discuss that a little. Why is your writing self an Anglophone self?
Well, I suppose because I grew up bilingual, and our parents were very my sister and I, our parents are very strict about always speaking English with my mother and Spanish with my father, and never mixing the two languages in a sentence or paragraph. But so much of my education was in English. And then because my father writes in Spanish, once I knew I wanted to be a writer, I thought that I would just, for my own sanity and for many reasons, I should just go down that path of that more Anglophone path. And when people ask me what I feel culturally, I think I feel Mexican and sort of pan-European, because I don't, but England is very much my home, and I've been there. I've lived in England longer than anywhere else at this point. So, but yeah, I often feel I fall between the cracks, and people don't often think of me when they're mentioning sort of young Mexican writers, but then I'm never mentioned as an American writer, and I'm not a British writer, even though I have that passport too. So I don't know. Most of the time it doesn't matter, but.
Yeah, it is intriguing, just because it does seem like I know that when I speak a different language, I feel that my personhood shifts a little bit, and and that we are sort of constructed. There's this odd complex neurological thing with language and selfhood, right? Where it's hard to know where one ends and the other begins.
Exactly.
So I wonder how different you would have been as a writer had you chosen to write in Spanish instead of English.
Well, when I go back to Mexico, and I left when I was 17, so sometimes I feel I've returned to my 17-year-old self in many ways. And even though I've, of course, continued reading and thinking, and sometimes writing in Spanish and having profound conversations in Spanish that went beyond those 17 years, but there is a part of me that taps back into that self, that teenage self, I think.
Do you think you're funnier in one language than in the other? Or are you differently funny in both? Because humor is really difficult, I think, in language. Now, since you grew up in both, maybe you're just
English is more nuanced, I think. The humor would probably be more nuanced and a bit sillier, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah. So it seems from these pieces that you had a kind of adventurous, perhaps romantic sort of teenagehood in Mexico. You want to talk a little bit about that, about your Gothic period?
Sure. So my sister and I, we grew up, well, in Mexico City, but we often went to London, or the 2 summers we spent in Berlin, summers in Europe. So we listened to mostly British music, and all our favorite bands were almost all, well, Sister Mercy, Susan the Banshees, The Cure, Joy Division, and Smiths, and Echo and the Bunnymen. And so anyway, but we grew up as goths, and there was a group of us in Mexico City who were all goths, and we immediately identified with one another. And my sister and I were the only ones in our school, but we would meet every weekend and go to a certain bar and club in downtown. And somehow that was the first little kingdom that we belonged to outside of home. And it was at the time quite empowering, because at school, I spent most lunchtimes alone in the library and hardly had any friends. But then once we discovered these kindred spirits in the nightlife, but it was also very liberating, and that sense of everyone was very creative and quite theatrical. And then I realized too, it was just, again, like so much of modern Mexican culture, but there was a really exciting syncretism going on of old world and new world, and in the marketplaces you could find all your silver skulls, and of course the Museum of Anthropology there was the stone skulls, and then we were, for us, the references were more contemporary, but in the background we had this whole cultural way of the past. And so yeah, looking back, those were actually, of my adolescence, very important moments and spaces.
Oh, yeah, I think you mentioned at some point, I can't remember where it is in the book, but how maybe the symbology or the connotations of skulls now in Mexico is different would be different, is more of a threatening encounter in certain ways now than it would have been. Do you think you could have a comparable experience growing up, like being a teenager in Mexico City now to the one that you had in your childhood?
I'm not sure. It was definitely safer back then. Now, well, when you're alluding to the skulls, the decapitated heads appear often in the news, and the violence has become so extreme, more in other parts of the country than in the city. But even so, when we go back, it's watching the daily news. It's really horrifying, and I think our parents would, back then in when the late 80s, would have male friends pick us up in their car and promise to bring us home at a certain hour. And then in the 90s would go out, my sister would drive, but I'm not sure. Everything has changed so much. I think there wouldn't be that sense of abandon, and young women just out on their own in the city.
Yeah. Let's talk about insomnia a bit. And so you have two pieces in here. One is fiction and the other is an essay. And you mention one in the other, and they're obviously in a conversation with each other. So you have I don't know, somewhat enchanted relationship with nighttime and with nocturnal wakefulness, and to such a degree that both in the fictional and non-fictional accounts of possibly attending a sleep clinic, or in one case of the fiction of actually attending it, there was ultimately a refusal of a cure or whatever. So maybe you could talk a little about that and the disinclination of yourself, and in this case a character, to part from insomnia and to part from the wakeful night.
Yes, well, because I've suffered from it all my life, my relationship has changed a lot. And there was a period, especially when I was living in Berlin, that it was actually very fertile, and those hours awake were actually very productive, and it somehow worked with creativity. Later in life, it's become more anguished, and I hardly work at night anymore. So then you really do want to just shut down the mental apparatus and go to sleep. But in that essay, I when I was writing it, I revisited all these short stories, and realized also in my novels that I never have a character who sleeps well, and it's almost the default mode. And someone who's, yeah, as this, well, a night of everything is, there's also the activation of fantasy and much more room for the fantastical, and then everything feels thrown into relief. And I noticed also, especially when I was living in Berlin, that museums, I'd gravitate immediately towards moonlit landscapes, and a particular kind of lighting and, well, or shadows and the paintings, and just realized it was such a part of me that I would miss it enormously if I suddenly began sleeping really well and no longer identify that way with these landscapes and haunted characters, and then concluded that actually we become so accustomed to our ailments and conditions, and it becomes such a part of us that it's very hard to part ways. But the title story is inspired by the Somnambulist and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and it's very much about, in that case, the sort of the confrontation between fantasy and reality, and how if you bring the fantasy home with you, then it rarely remains intact, and often those sort of nighttime reveries by day lose some of their sheen or mystery.
So there's something about the night, maybe it's unknowability, that that conjures a certain magic or romanticism.
Mm-hmm.
Or is the primary romance with wakefulness itself, or simply with being present at night, do you think? Sleeplessness, wakefulness, whatever.
I think it's a lot to do with the threshold between the two. It's something about lingering on the threshold between those two states and not being firmly in either land. And it can be very stimulating, but also anxiety provoking. But I think it's very much something about that threshold and staying in it for too long and not committing to either, or feeling like neither world wants you or has claimed you.
Yeah, the solitude of that like liminal state or whatever.
Yeah, the solitude is a big part of it.
Yeah, yeah. So tell us about sea monkeys.
Well, that's a very American thing.
Did you ever have them?
We did. My sister and I had them as children, and we actually set up a stand outside of our house and tried selling them to neighbors in little bags. And needless to say, no one bought any. But then they were so strange that I remember years later reading about them, and somehow came up with the idea for the story. And but I remember also seeing in comics, there were often ads for sea monkeys.
Right. And those ads were brilliant. They were like a stroke of genius. The way that the sea monkeys were drawn as these sort of like, mythological ocean creatures, quasi-human. Yeah. Yes. That was the brilliance of the brine shrimp swindle. Although I'm not sure it was a swindle. They were kind of cool, just floating around in there. I had a tank too. Like actually in my 20s, when I was living in LA, I had a little kit, and they're sort of interesting, and then they're maybe not as much anymore. But there's it's an intriguing story, the one with sea monkeys. I recommend it to those who have not read the book yet. Let's see. Oh, and I wanted to ask about stray dogs in Mexico too, because I think you cited a statistic, something like 70% of dogs in Mexico. Do I have that right? That maybe 70% are strays, something like that?
Think very high. Yeah, it's very high.
So why do you think that? Is that just an absence of certain institutional mechanisms? Is it just the collective love of these sort of the pathos of these figures and these creatures, or what do you think accounts for that? Because there are plenty of countries that that just don't have that many stray animals.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, what do you think about that? I'm just curious.
And it's the country in Latin America with the most stray dogs. But I think Mexicans have very passionate relationship with them, but then they very easily abandon them too. So I think there's a moment when many Mexican or Mexican family feels a tremendous urge to have a dog, or they adopt them for a while or feed them, because there are so many, and then the sterilization programs have been very lax. I think they've gotten a bit better. And actually just last week when I was in Mexico City, my sister and I were noticing that there seemed to be far fewer in the city. And so I think now finally maybe perhaps sterilization programs have gotten better, but for so many years there seemed to be multiplying in striking numbers. But and on the pilgrimages, on the pilgrimage every year, the Virgen de Guadalupe, and the basilica, they have them as companions and they abandon them. And but I think there's such a part of daily life that most people, well, I don't know, I think quite temperamentally, one moment they're embraced and the next they're abandoned. But there's strong feelings in either direction.
And you do love animals in general, and they do figure in some of these accounts. And actually, the other time that I met you electronically was during an event that you organized, I think, for writers. I thought it was Writers Rebel.
It is.
Yeah. So and maybe you could talk about how that. So this is part of Extinction Rebellion, sort of, or affiliated with it for those who don't know. And it's writers who speak up about biodiversity loss and the extinction crisis and climate havoc and all of that. Yeah, and it's really great. And Chloe's involved in that. And maybe you could talk a little about, I don't know, that part of you and how because I often get asked this question, and I do find it actually quite difficult to answer for myself. Maybe you have a better answer. Sort of how that love intersects with the work that you do, and or are they only, is the Venn diagram very, very small between the words on the page and that love of the natural world?
No, it's a good question, because it's something I'm very aware of. Unlike you, I haven't really brought that into my fiction yet, and at some point I think I will, but they really run along parallel paths, the fiction and sort of the life of the imagination, and then the activism I do, or I try to be engaged in as much as possible in England. But with this On the Brink, it was because our group Writers Rebel is part of Extinction Rebellion, the literary chapter, but we I just felt that so much of the talk was about human survival, and I said, what about all the other species and that we're going to bring down with us, and we're vanishing at a terrifying rate. And so I thought of coming up with this. It was during the pandemic, having a Zoom event and asking 20 cultural figures, including you spoke of the orangutan,
right?
That really beautifully. So we had 20 mostly writers, but different cultural figures. We had Amitav Ghosh, and my father spoke about the Paquita porpoise. Margaret Atwood, Emma Thompson spoke about the puffin, and we had 20 cultural figures speaking for 5 minutes each about a species in danger of extinction, and it's something that I just vowed to myself that, and whatever very quiet way one could, but always try to bring other species into the conversation, however one could. And our group, I think I'm the only writer in our group who doesn't address the climate emergency directly in their fiction, but we said, we all pledged to, whatever public platform we had, that we would speak about it. And I guess in my fiction, what I do have are pigeons and stray dogs and sort of urban, fragile urban ecosystems, and I feel very strongly that every human story, other species are always implicated, and
you have salamanders, of course, the salamanders of Mexico City.
Yeah,
in the and actually at the very end of the book, there is a mention. I'm not going to issue so-called spoilers or whatever, but there's a mention of salamanders, and it reminded me so strongly, actually, of another sort of old favorite book of mine, The War with the Newts by Karl Čapek, in which giant salamanders rise
Oh yeah,
up.
I hadn't thought of that. Yeah.
Yes, so it really it was it took me to War with the Newts immediately. Well, I don't know if people have questions now or if they want us to keep on talking, but I think Chloe would be happy to take any questions. Or Peter, did you want to see if there's anything in the chat? Or
yeah, so everybody, please do post your comments, your questions. We don't have anything just yet, so if you want to maybe give them a couple of minutes to kind of form their thoughts, that would be great.
Great. I have another question. It's a little bit of a factual question. I really liked the essay on the cosmonauts, and I had never, I'm ashamed to say, never heard of the first woman in space. And I think it's odd that I hadn't heard of that, because I know all about Leica. I've read, I know about the space chimps, right? So I knew a fair amount about the first non-human animals that went to space, but I never knew of, I believe it's Valentina Tereshkova or something like that.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of intriguing allusion to her in the essay to the fact that she did not thrive, although she hid this from sort of the media or whatever when she returned, but she did not thrive in her brief few-hour stint in space. And I ever since I read the essay, I've been wondering what the manner was of her not thriving. Like, was this physical? Was it mental? Do you know? Because like it's totally unclear what she was alluding to when she says that it was difficult or terrible for her.
Well, when I was researching that essay, which Into the Cosmos, which I think came out in 2012, so it's not fresh in my mind, but I do remember that you really had to read between the lines in most of the reports, the government reports, and it was all quite murky and mysterious. So, and we felt like many euphemisms were being used. So when she didn't thrive, I think she had some sort of mental breakdown when she more visible and probably less restrained than some of her male counterparts, or that at least tried to hide or defer their breakdowns after they returned from space. But when they said she did not thrive, I seem to remember it was that she just from the moment she was sent out into space, she felt extremely uneasy and didn't really listen to orders and wasn't doing what they wanted her to do. And then when she returned to Earth, it was clear that the relationship wasn't going to work between the space station and the government and her. But yeah, I was very curious, because that's one of the few times I've researched an essay or a piece when I really had to, where you have to really use your imagination to figure out what.
Yeah, there were huge volumes of disinformation around the cosmonauts and the Soviet space dogs and stuff for decades afterward, and myths were told of Leica for that only were clarified very recently. So I'm sure it was probably multiplied with the human subjects. If there aren't any questions yet, let me see what other things I wanted to. Oh yeah, what about, so you're you have a significant interest in music and also in visual art. Can you talk about painting and how it relates to your work or informs your work, or other forms of visual art, not just painting? Maybe talk about that a little bit.
Sure. Why, in another life, I would have loved to have been a painter, and so of any visual art form, I think that's the one that I'm drawn to the most and feel most inspired writing about or responding to in some way. And so some recent commissions have actually been to write short stories around artworks. Recently, I wrote a short story responding to Paula Rego triptych at the National Gallery when she was artist in residence in the early 90s at the National Gallery. And she made amazing triptych called Crivelli's Garden. And she wandered through the National Gallery and sketched the different female saints and mythological figures, and then used as models a lot of the female museum staff, and created this triptych that used to be at the far end of the restaurant in the Sainsbury wing, and now it has its own space. But anyway, so my own frustration in times of not having become a painter has been mostly resolved by writing about painting, and then our family friendship with Leonora Carrington seems to just keep, this is sort of a giving tree that keeps resurfacing in my life. And I guest curated the show at Tate Liverpool of Leonora's work in 2015, and then was in an art film called Female Human Animal that was inspired, that grew out of that curatorial job, and then I've just ended up writing quite a bit about painting, but my private passion or magic lanterns and these pre-cinema instruments, toys and instruments. And I've now every autumn I put on a magic lantern show in London at the Swedenborg Society, and that again is sort of creating new narratives around found images. And in the Swedenborg archive, they're mostly black and white photographs taken by Swedenborgians, and often quite mysterious, of vacant streets and very strange portraits, or diagrams illustrating his theories. But anyway, so I created 7 different vignettes around the slides, and then we have music and a magic lanternist. So I just, every now and then, because writing is so solitary, I very much like having these collaborations in the art world. But.
Yeah, for sure. So when you were growing up, your father was, of course, a poet, still is, and then also a diplomat, correct? And both of those things, especially the poetry, but also the other part of it. How do you think they were embedded in you as a writer? How do you think that sort of played out?
Well, I think, oh, and I forgot to mention that my parents, they also had an environmental group, and that actually was what inspired me a lot to become part of one. But well, very much seeing him at his desk from childhood onwards, and just taking the profession so seriously, and realizing that, yes, you could spend all day just looking at books and with a pen in your hand. And so from very early on, I thought that's probably what I wanted to do too. But I read a great deal of poetry, and often, especially towards the end of any book, the very final draft, I embark on this process of distillation, and I read almost only poetry, and that's when I polish and sort of chisel away at the prose until I'm happy with it. And so I've written very, very few poems in my life, but thanks to my father, it's always been very much part of my world.
And you bring that sort of economy of sentences to the other writing that you do, even if you don't write sort of formal poetry. It sounds like it's part of your critical self-review. So maybe you are. That's the poetry. Yeah. It looks like we do have a couple of questions in the chat. There is, well, there's just a speculation from Richard Nash, who says, I wonder if Chloe's early work, the stuff that Lydia wondered if Chloe might have rejected, if those pieces might not be, in a way, stray dogs themselves.
That's yeah, I hadn't thought of that, but actually, they are maybe later on in the essay, in the stray dog essay, I mention them as life forces of their own that are sort of always moving there at different levels of the plot or the world, the fictional world. But yeah, maybe they are stray dogs that I've summoned back and nourished, and now given them their own lives.
Okay, and then there's another comment from Alexis de Chonek. Can you talk more about your experience curating for Leonora Carrington at Tate Liverpool? And also says, excited to read this new collection and wants to know what might be the subject of your next novel. So a couple of questions there.
Well, so for Leonora, Leonora Carrington hadn't had a show in England since the Serpentine in the early 90s. And so it's been the largest exhibition of hers in England, even though she was English, but left when she was 19 and never returned. But and a lot of her major paintings are in collections in Mexico, and then an extraordinary mural she made called The Magical World of the Mayas hangs upstairs in the Anthropological Museum in Mexico City. So there's a lot of work that actually never left the country before. Also a cradle that she painted for a friend's daughter. And so we wanted very much to show Leonora and all her different dimensions, and instead of caption, we wanted her spirit to sort of preside over the exhibition, almost like a seance. So instead of having captions, we just had quotes from her on the walls. And since she always said that painting came out, she didn't really know what the imagination was, that things just happened, and she never liked explaining her work and believed in some sort of more mysterious source. So we wanted to respect that and really let visitors somehow enter her minds and imagination in a less prescribed way. It was very special. It's a shame it was in Liverpool and there was never a, well, no, it's not a shame it was in Liverpool, but only because many people didn't see it and there wasn't a catalog. So actually, so this film, this art house film, Female Human Animal, is almost the only documentation of that exhibition because it comes out so much. But we found extraordinary masks she made for the Tempest, tapestries, and bronze sculptures, and early drawings of hers when she was at art school in Florence. And so it showed a real progression, but also something I thought about a lot was also she has so many hybrids in her paintings, and also the notion of hybridity, especially within surrealism, and so many of them were emigres, and even in L'Autre hybrids somehow, surrealists identify a lot with hybrids, and this exhibition of Leonora's, I think, was a celebration of that.
What about the question about your next novel?
Oh, well, I think I'm finished with it, but so anyway, there's a magic lantern at its center, and the title is actually a line from Freud. It's called The Shadow of the Object, and it's, yeah, and the thread through the book is a magic lantern. So, but you know, one thinks a book is finished, but I think it's finished.
And where is it set?
It starts in Mexico City, but it's mostly set in London, and then actually with flashbacks to Germany and Holland. So I actually do have a little bit of my childhood in Holland in the book, memories.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are you finishing the book, Lydia?
Oh, I'm sort of in the middle of several books at the same time. Yeah. Thank you for asking. But yeah, three novels I'm working on. Yeah. And then I have a book coming out next year, which is not fiction, in April, called We Loved It All, which is about having children in the age of extinction, essentially. But thank you. If no one has any other messages, I'll hand it back over to Peter, I guess.
Well, that was a delight. Thank you both for this. And as we approach the top of the hour, I want to remind everyone we have posted links with which you may purchase copies of this fabulous, fabulous book, Dialogue with the Somnambulist, and also Lydia's books as well. So please do check it out. Also, if you're in the hood, come on down and browse our stacks. We have a full selection from both our authors. And we're now open 7 days a week from 10 a.m. to 10 p.m., slowly getting back to our pre-pandemic hours. Also want to point out the City Lights is celebrating its 70th anniversary in 2023. We're going to be featuring a special calendar of events running all the way through to the end of the year. So please do visit our event calendar on our website to learn more about that. Today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, continuing the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, through public events like this one, our publishing program, and educational outreach, all dedicated to sustaining a vibrant community of readers, writers, and independent thinkers. So goodbye, everyone. Take care. We hope to see you all again soon.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.